Well, hello, everybody, and welcome to another Kepler Live. Today we have Emily Wells with us, one of our Latin teachers. Welcome, Emily.
Thank you for having me.
So I'm excited to be talking to, for Kepler at least, someone who is a pure Latin teacher. So you are offering this you're offering this coming term a course that is pure exam prep for the National Latin Exam, as well as Wheelock's Latin 1, and then a Latin Readers course. Maybe you could kind of run us through, we'll get into detail about the classes a little later, and I definitely want to talk about you, and we want to get to know you, but maybe we could start this video off, this live off, and welcome again, everybody, by you running us through the arc of those three courses.
Yes, so the Wheelock's textbook takes about 2 years to go through, so it's very quick. You can cover essentially all of Latin grammar in 2 years. So Latin 1 is the first year of that course, and then in Latin 2 we'll finish the book and students will be have completed Latin grammar and be ready just to read Latin and translate from a variety of Roman and medieval authors, and then that's what we'll be doing in the Readers course. And the Readers course is open for anybody who's finished Latin grammar. It doesn't matter if it was Wheelock's or, Jenny's or Henley or Lingua Latina. If they've done completed Latin grammar, they're welcome to join it. And we're going to just be reading, just introducing students to a good variety of Roman and medieval authors. They'll do like Livy and Pliny. He describes the eruption of Mount Vesuvius, which is really fun. He writes to the Emperor Trajan about what first century Christians are like, and we read selections from the Latin Bible. So my goal is kind of get students reading in Latin. And then the National Latin Exam is for students who want to have an opportunity to study often things that go even beyond what they're studying in their Latin courses. So most Latin courses, like in mine, we try and include a lot of Roman history and cultural information and things that we get in English from Latin. But the National Latin Exam preparation is a way to go even beyond that and get even more into those things like mythology and geography. And students from all over the US and the world take that course. So I prepare students for that exam.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I wonder. You say that the Readers course is open to those who have finished Latin grammar. Is there any end to Latin grammar? Is that a thing?
Not really.
So completing
it
does
continue, but they finished it as far as official textbooks goes, and they're ready to read. Yeah.
Well, okay. So there's a definite arc to it, and later on we'll get into each of those courses. But I would love to hear about you. Tell us a little bit about your family, your growing up, and then I'd love to hear about how you became a teacher. What got you into teaching?
Yes. Well, I live in North Idaho, which is where I grew up, and I actually grew up taking online classes in high school. So my dad, Wes Callahan, was one of the first people to teach online classes back in the 90s. So back in the day with dial-up, and to take up the phone line. So my parents had to get a second landline so that we could still get phone calls.
My kids heard a sound effect that was like the dial-up sound effect, and they had no earthly idea what that was, and it boggled their mind when we explained it to them.
Yeah, it was so stressful at the time, but now it's like good memories.
Yeah. Well, like so many stressful things. So actually, before you continue, I have to ask what that looked like, an online class in 1999. I don't know what years it was, but how? I mean, obviously, so much has progressed from a technological perspective. What did online classes look like then?
Well, it was mostly it would be the teacher talking over the microphone. Sometimes there would be webcam, but often it would interfere with the audio too much, or the webcam would just freeze in unflattering positions, your mouth wide open or something. So so usually the webcam was off, and it was just the teacher talking over audio, and then the students would be responding in the chat box, and sometimes we would, as students, use the microphone to answer as well. But now it's like so fancy. You can have the whole class on webcam at once, and PowerPoint and whiteboard. I think we had whiteboard actually, but you know, you can use whiteboard so much better now, and you can split, you know, classes into breakout rooms. It's just like really amazing, just the technology now.
Yeah, I mean, sharing videos, all that stuff.
Yeah, but it worked back then. It was amazing, just the you know, like how you could still convey a really good education even with just the teacher talking and the students responding through the chat box and stuff, even with just the basics.
Yeah, oh, absolutely. And that really emphasizes how it's so much of a good education and of a good class is the teacher, right? And so
Yes.
you have the teacher even with primitive technology. I
Yes.
homeschooled through the 90s, and I do have to
Okay.
say my correspondence typing class
Oh, yeah?
was not so great. But that's because, you know, it's just a book that was mailed to me, and then I had to mail back my results. I think I'm a little older than you. But yes, having a teacher.
But you were really on the cutting edge there.
Yeah, yeah. Oh goodness, the 90s. Well, yes. So that was quite an excursion. We were talking
Yes.
about you, and so you grew up in North Idaho. You took online
Yes.
classes as a kid. Where are you now? How did you become a teacher?
So I became a teacher. My family was living in Pennsylvania for a year. And my dad was helping Veritas develop their omnibus curriculum, and so they wanted him to teach there, and they didn't have a Latin teacher. They were very desperate, so they asked me to teach. I was a senior in high school. I'd never taught before, but I found out it was something that I really loved doing, and you know, I loved my students, and I found out I loved Latin, so they hired me to teach Latin to their elementary school. And I just found out I loved it. It's beautiful language. I loved even just the grammar, but mostly I just loved working with my students, and I realized that was what I wanted to do. So then when we were only going to be there for a year, when we moved back to Idaho, then I started, my dad started passing off his Latin classes to me, and I took over all of his Latin classes and tutored locally as well, did homeschool classes as well.
And here you are now with
And
Kepler.
here I am. I'm very excited to be here with you guys.
I love that you said that, you know, you might not have meant to give this away, but you found out that you love Latin by teaching it. And I actually had the exact same experience. I grew up speaking Spanish, but I realized I loved Spanish when I started teaching it.
Yes.
So I get that. That's actually very cool. I think that's a ringing endorsement for the passion of a teacher when they find out they love a subject because they had to teach it.
Yeah. Yep. I loved it before, but I didn't realize I loved it that much.
Right. No,
now we know.
And I didn't mean to put you on the spot, but I actually that really resonated with my own experience.
Yeah.
Well, let's talk about your classes. You know, so when I was in college, I did WheeLox in 1 year. Was I done a disservice?
No, not at all. It's actually a college text designed to take college students through in a year, and we do it in 2 years for high school students. So in high school, we do about 1 chapter a week, and then in college, you blaze through it 2 or 3 chapters a week, I think.
Okay. Well, I mean, WheeLox is a classic that's obviously been through
Yes.
many iterations, but maybe you could talk a little bit about that curriculum and about the class itself.
Yeah. WheeLox, one thing that I really love about it is since I would like to get students reading in Latin in the original, WheeLox includes original sentences from Roman and medieval authors right from chapter 1. So students are translating, as you know, just the original sentences, and some of them are modified a little bit to match the vocabulary or grammar of where the students are at, you know, especially in the beginning of the book. But some of them are just actual sentences and paragraphs that the Romans actually wrote, which is great because you can see kind of a window into the Roman mindset and worldview. And some of it's very relatable, like it's all of human nature. You know, you can look at it and say, wow, that was written 2,000 years ago and we feel exactly the same way about that thing. But then there's other there's other stuff that's just very uniquely Roman. It's a good opportunity to learn a little bit more about the Romans, but it gets the students reading actual Roman literature rather than, British or American authors who are coming up with Latin stories, which is also great. But what I'm going for is getting the students to read the original as soon as possible. And so I love Wheelocked because it does that, and it's kind of unique that way, I think.
Yeah, I thoroughly enjoyed my Wheelock's experience. But yeah, it's interesting that you put it that way, talking about the context that Wheelock's puts you in, because that seems to be a natural flow then into your reader's course.
Yes. Yes. Yeah.
So you explore that for us.
The reader's course.
Yes.
So then the reader's course is great, and we're using the actually the Wheelock's Latin Reader just because it has a good selection, but it's open to anybody. You don't have to have had Wheelock's to be able to do it. It just has a good selection of Roman and medieval authors. We'll translate some Cicero, some of his famous speeches. We'll translate some of Livy's history of the founding of Rome, in the original. We'll translate some Pliny. I think I mentioned he has an eyewitness account of the eruption of Vesuvius, and his uncle Pliny the Elder dies, and he describes that. And then the Emperor Trajan asks him to look into first century Christians, and he writes and gives a report about that. And then Trajan writes back with how he should handle them. And then students get to translate a lot of passages from the Bible, the Latin Bible, the Vulgate. And that was the most widely read book in the last 1,500 years. And so it's really neat that they get to read that, and a lot of passages from there. And then we do some medieval stories as well. So, and the goal for that course is just to expose students to a variety of Roman and medieval authors, and they can translate some famous works and passages. And then if students want, near the end of the year, we'll have some flexibility. So if they want to, say, spend a few weeks translating Augustine's Confessions from Latin, or more of the Bible, or maybe if they want to try Virgil, then we'll open it up so that they can have the opportunity to do something that they would like, or maybe one of the authors they read they really loved. We could do more Pliny or Livy or something too.
Right.
So.
Yeah, the connection to some of the church fathers, and certainly to the medieval church, is one of the aspects of studying Latin that I most enjoyed. The most satisfying thing I ever did studying Latin was to learn O come, Emmanuel in Latin.
Yes.
Just a small little thing, but what a pleasure that was, and to feel a connection with saints of the past. And it seems like Latin has an advantage over a lot of other, at least for us, and with a Western European sort of trail to our heritage.
Yes.
It was very satisfying and very connecting. The culture of Latin students around the country, and I suppose around the world, seems to be a relatively unique thing, and millions of memes are produced by Latin students. There's a particular sort of meme that usually runs something like, first year translations in my French class, I would like a cup of coffee, please. First year translations in my Latin class, after the fleet was put to the sword, he killed himself by leaping from the wall, or whatever it might be.
There's a lot of death in Latin. Death, tyrants.
So I'd actually kind of love to take that idea of the distinctiveness of studying Latin. I'd love for you to cast it backwards into what we've just talked about, and some of the material in your courses. But then I'd also wonder if you could take that idea and explore the why of studying Latin.
Yes.
If I'm going to be studying about leaping off of a wall after military disgrace, why am I doing that?
Well, that's really interesting because, for French, the goal is to be able, to speak French, read it, and so ordering a cup of coffee is very appropriate. For Latin, at least for my course, I want to get students reading in it, and so there's a lot about death, partly because some people think that that's what will engage teenagers and college students, and it's true.
Yeah, it is true.
But that was more of a reality in some ways for the Romans than it is for us. And so, and of course, so they are partly purposefully choosing those texts. There were a lot of it. I feel like the students also read a lot of Cicero, which is a little more dry but passionate. I actually love Cicero. He's very sarcastic and fun to read too. But yeah, it was just a different, it's a different culture. And so they're getting into different kind of thing when you study an ancient language than when you're learning conversational Latin.
And I think the intersection between an ancient culture and then all the uses of that Latin has had over the years, it makes it quite a unique field of study.
Yes.
Because you get a little bit of both. You get to see the living language and that past that is distant and foreign and alien to us at the same time. I think that's a very cool aspect of studying Latin.
Yes. And I like what you said about how it's been just such a part of our own cultural heritage for so long. And we in the Western culture have participated in that for so long, like you said, as a living language, when the Romans were speaking it and conquering the world. And then with the church, the church using Latin to spread the gospel, since the Romans had forced everybody to learn Latin when they conquered. Now there's a way for missionaries from one country to go to a country on the other side of the world, and their native languages are completely different, but they both knew Latin, so they were able to go bring the gospel around the world. And God used the Latin Bible to go out through all of the Western culture and bring the gospel to people that way. And it's just been a huge part of our culture all through the ages. Then, of course, it became the language of the Western Church for a long time, and scholars kept it going. So, if you read any theology or philosophy or literature or history, a lot of those books throughout the ages were originally written in Latin, like Anselm and Aquinas and Kepler and Copernicus and Isaac Newton, Charles Darwin, C.S. Lewis and Dorothy Sayers were fluent in Latin. They just throw quotes in their books and assume we know how to translate them. And for most of my students, they tell their great-grandparents they're studying Latin, or their grandparents, and the grandparents say, oh, amo amasamat. Like, it's something our culture has participated in a lot of ways for the last 2,000 years. And it's really neat to be able to study that and to see the different ways where God has used it in time and history.
Mm-hmm. Well, those of you who are viewing, we welcome your comments and questions. We would just love to talk Latin with you guys. If you have that experience of, amo amasamat, we'd love to hear about that. So definitely feel free to hop into the comment section and quiz us and interact with us. So I want to put you on the spot, Emily. Are you ready?
Yes,
okay.
I'm ready.
All right, here we go. I'm a Spanish teacher. And some of the arguments I hear for the utility of studying Latin. Now, I don't believe in education for utility's sake. Okay, so if you told me just that Latin is beautiful, that'd be good enough, as far as I'm concerned.
Well, it is.
But it is. I totally agree with that. But as far as like, hey, you know what? You'll do great on the SAT, and your vocabulary will be fabulous. And I think to myself, well, I mean, Spanish would kind of do that too. So, what special impact, unique impact does the study of Latin have on the young, beautiful minds?
Well, it is true that any language will increase students' precision of thought and help them on the SAT. Latin has had a unique influence on English. Both Latin and Greek contribute about 60 to 80% of our English vocabulary. And we get a lot of, obviously a lot of words from those languages directly. We get a lot of our own grammar. We get a lot of our own ways of thinking from the way the Romans and the medievals have used Latin. Mm-hmm. And so it's had a very direct impact on English. And then it's also impacted other languages that were either influenced by Latin or came directly from Latin. So like French and Spanish and Italian and Portuguese and Romanian, the Romance languages. either came from
I'm
Latin
so
or were
glad you
really
didn't.
impacted by it.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. I was just going to say, I'm so glad that you did not forget Portuguese or Romanian,
Oh,
I
oh, good.
suppose. But thank you. Thank you for that. Anyway, proceed.
Yes.
I'm sorry.
So, so if you do take something like Spanish, that does have a lot of the Latin influences, and that will help your SATs perhaps in a different way than like if you took Russian. Now, taking Russian would still help your SATs. It would still increase your precision of thought and your analytical mind and stretch you in different ways. But I think Spanish would relate a little more closely to English, and then Latin even more so. So for the SATs in that way. And I think that is, I agree that I wouldn't, for me as a teacher, I feel like Latin is good and beautiful on its own, as you said, but I do think it is great for the students. There are so many useful benefits that come from Latin, like the SATs, or if you do want to study a modern language,
Yes.
that comes from Latin.
And, not just speaking of utility, but even connection. I mean,
Yes.
Latin was used in a way that no other Romance language has been used for longer across so many fields. What you mentioned about, favorite authors of ours just tossing out phrases as if we could translate them. I long to connect with the older authors that I read, and that's a great way to do it. There is, I think, something unique in the way Latin shapes your thinking that you can't get from other beautiful languages that I endorse the study of as well.
Yeah, it's part of our common cultural heritage that we have in a different way than some other languages are.
So Daniel Fukushon comments that French is sanctified Latin. So I suppose Latin was just waiting to become French.
Yes.
But we have a question from Jacques Maritain. Can someone living in the modern world today obtain a truly classical education without studying Latin? Or is it better to study modern languages? So kind of touching on what I did, but can you have, there are almost two questions in there. Can you have a truly classical education without studying Latin? And then, I'll just leave it at that. I'll leave it at the question he posed. Or she. We don't know who this actually is.
Well, and I mean, it might depend on some of the terms, but how they would be defined. In some ways, no, because a truly classical education did include the study of Latin and Greek if you are doing it the way that classical education has been throughout a lot of our cultural heritage. It had to include learning the grammar of Latin and Greek and reading those authors. But I think in other ways you can get that by reading. You can get that through all the literature, the history, the philosophy, the theology that you can read. You can still participate in the great education and be classically educated, even if you only know English. So I guess it just depends if you mean a classical education the way it was taught for a long time, or if you mean learning the material. It could go either way.
Right. Now, you used a phrase in there that I cannot resist asking you about. The great education. What is the great education? That sounds capitalized.
I think I might have meant to say the great conversation. I think that's probably what I meant to say.
Okay. Yeah, that does make more sense in context. I love the idea. We should explore sometime over coffee what the great education might be. So a quote is shared with us that it seems like a COVID-19 influenced adaptation of a quote about poetry.
Okay.
So this is Valerie's adaptation. Reading works in translation is like trying to kiss your husband through a face mask. And so, it's an endorsement of, if you want to meet your ancestors, you want to kiss them without a face mask.
Right.
So teach your kids Latin.
Yeah.
And then,
yeah, that's great.
Yeah. Chat is trolling each other. So Scott responds to Daniel asking if French fries are then sanctified potatoes. We're going to have to rein these people
Well, I
in.
don't know. As an Idahoan and Irish woman, I don't know.
Yeah, the potato
Any
was just
potato is,
waiting for
I love French
Idaho.
fries. Yes, I'm so thankful for French fries.
Amen, sister. Well, let's talk about the National Latin Exam Preparation class. Could you actually just tell our viewers who may not know what the National Latin Exam is?
So the National Latin Exam is run by William and Mary College and back in Pennsylvania. And it's actually, they call it the National Latin Exam, but students all over the world take it. There's many, many countries that participate in it. And it's just a fun way for students to learn more than just Latin grammar, but you learn mythology, geography, culture, Latin history, derivatives, some conversational Latin. And the exam is kind of like a standardized test. It's like students see the questions, they fill in bubbles to answer it. And and about half of the questions are about grammar, where students translate a sentence and identify like the subject or a clause or a correct translation. And then the rest of the questions are, identifying a place on a map or answering questions about mythology and stuff. So it's just a really good way to teach students more about Roman culture and history as well. And a lot of that comes through in classes, but this just gets you even more in depth into it. So it's not an evaluation of whatever their course is, because it's not based on any one textbook. So it shouldn't be, you can't judge their particular Latin course by that. But it's a really wonderful experience to go through and study these things.
Now, the lover of Latin and the enthusiastic Latin student would, I'm sure, enjoy taking this test. You actually describe it as being fun or enjoyable. Somewhere in there you wrote about how fun an exam it is. But for a practically minded parent, why would my student take this exam?
For practical reasons, I think parents who like doing things like the SAT and other standardized tests really like doing the National Latin Exam. It's fun to compare and see how your student does or how your school does against other students in schools around the country. When students, every year when they grade all the tests that come in, they find the average score for that class, and a student has to beat that or get a score higher than the average score to win anything. So you get a certificate in Latin, like magna cum laude. If you're a little higher, you get a silver medal and a maxima cum laude certificate. If you get a gold, you get summa cum laude certificate in gold and a gold medal. And the medals say SPQR, which is the motto of Rome, Senatus Populusque Romanus, Senate People of Rome. So it's really cool for the Latin students to get their gold and silver medals. If you get several years of gold medals in a row, you're eligible for scholarships in college, for Latin classes in college. And I think you get a nice dictionary as well. And
so are you saying it's about the swag? I feel like you're saying it's about the
you
swag.
asked
why
practical people would take it.
But
the swag is very fun.
Yeah. Now this course is relatively independent. Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah. So it's and I want to point out to viewers that it's only $150 a semester. So it's a great way to continue your Latin education. A few comments and questions from our comments section. Wesley Callahan says that students catch a teacher's enthusiasm. Do you have a favorite Latin author you enthuse over?
Well, first of all, hi, Dad. Thank you for the great question. Oh man, I love Cicero. I think he's great. The name Cicero, Kikero, means garbanzo bean or chickpea, and it was originally an insult for, people think it was an insult for his ancestor's nose that probably had a bump on it or looked weird or something like that. And Cicero is just very noble. He stood up for his ideals. Sometimes I think he was wrong, but he was fiery and determined, and he was, in the end, assassinated by Mark Antony, being hunted down as an old man as the slaves were trying to carry him away. So it's this very sad, tragic ending as he stood up to a lot of the ideals of the Republic during the tumultuous time when Rome was starting to become an empire. So I really like him. I love reading Virgil and have my students translate Virgil because it's so fun to scan the poetry first. So you learn to identify the feet and the meter, and you scan it. And this kind of goes back to Valerie's comment. She was doing a modern version of T.S. Eliot's quote, reading the Latin translations, like kissing a woman through a veil. So I really like her version of it.
We're going to call it the COVID-19 version.
Yeah, that's great. And and how you lose so much in a translation. Like, there's really great translators that can convey the meter and the metaphors and a lot of the sense that the Roman authors have, but it's just not quite the same. So like my students in my Latin 2 class this last year, we translated a few lines of Virgil and we scanned it first, and even scanning the poetry brings it more alive. Like when he talks about Jupiter calming the sky and storms, or smoothing the sky and storms, the meter that Virgil chooses slows it way down. So like if Valerie's still watching, he has a bunch of spondies, and so it's just, you're forced to slow down. It's not da 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 da. It's just, he's talking about calming the sky and storms and smoothing it, and that just shows up. Effect. You feel it smoothing. Yes, you feel it. Your voice is smoothed out as you're reading it, and even if you were just translating the Latin straight, you wouldn't get it. But if you're reading it as the Latin poetry, as Virgil meant it, you get that. So I really love Virgil because it's so much more comes to light when you translate him. So that would be one of my favorites to translate with my students.
Did your dad know that how much you would enthuse when he asked that question? He must have. He must have been. I'm gonna set a match to Tinder and watch her go.
Yeah.
That was awesome.
You might have suspected about Cicero because I loved Cicero in high school.
Okay. All right. Awesome. Well, Carla Memot asks, we touched on this a little, but I'd love for you to develop it and open it up a bit. What are your thoughts about Latin as a form of disciplining the mind?
I think it's excellent for disciplining the mind. As all the words, the nouns and verbs are conjugated or declined, they change their ending to change the meaning. And students have to be able to work with that in very precise ways. It's a very precise language. It really increases your analytical powers. And other languages that are like that could do that too. Like Greek is very similar. And even modern languages do that, but not as much. They're a little different, just like English is a little different. We're more based on word order than on identifying every single ending to figure out the part of speech and the construction and everything. So that's one of the big ways that Latin can discipline the mind.
That was something that I, as a speaker of Romance languages, was quite struck by when I studied Latin. Was how much agility was required, and of course I didn't have the agility as a student, but it developed, and it was the sort of agility that speaking English or speaking a Romance language didn't bring. It was a whole other thing, and I loved the effect that it had on my brain for at least that little while. I'm not sure how much Latin I retain now. Do you accept adult learners in your Latin classes?
I do. Yes, the classes are designed for high school students, but I have had adults take it. We've had graduate students take it, and adults who either want to study Latin with their kids, or they're a Latin teacher and just want to get ahead of the classes they're taking. So yes, I would love to accept adult learners.
Come one, come all.
Yes.
And then a rhetorical question, so don't answer this, but Daniel says, language is civilization. Is there a better key to or preserver of Western civilization than learning Latin? And you've just
Am I
gotten your
supposed to
dad
say
to sign
French?
up. Yeah, I really feel like you are. What is Daniel doing over there? But speaking of, his mother is offering an excellent French course
Oh, it looks
as
so
well.
good. Yes. I would love it just to be able to spend more time with her. She's she's wonderful. The students will just love being in her course.
Well, we're doing a live with her from her home next week, which I'm
Oh,
I'm
that'll be
really
wonderful.
I'm hoping to catch some food. Her husband
Yes.
is a gastronomic genius.
Yes, definitely. That will
Well,
be
we really
wonderful.
appreciate everyone's interactions. It's been lovely to
Yes,
have
thank you.
everybody asking questions, and um, really enjoyed having you here. And so you said you live in northern Idaho. We actually are only
I
a few
do.
miles apart right now, so
Yes,
I'm looking forward to being able to meet you and share a cup of coffee with you. Do you have any
that would be
final
great.
words you might offer to families, to students, in encouraging them to take your courses? Your dad
Um,
mentioned that you're enthusiastic, but yes, other
yes.
reasons.
I am really enthusiastic. I do, and I love my students a lot. I try and encourage them with whatever they're doing, and help them grow as students. Often being a high school class online is a really good opportunity for students to learn self-discipline because, a lot of the homework is done on their own. And it's just a really great time for a lot of growth as far as work habits, learning to trust the Lord, how much of a priority do you give grades? What about procrastination? And I look for opportunities to kind of encourage them in those areas in class. When to use wisdom, and you need to maybe um, turn off your phone or your computer when you're studying so you're not texting friends and stuff. But then there's other times when maybe something's more important than getting your schoolwork done, like maybe you help your grandma or, help your friend or something, and loving your neighbor comes first, and just, encouraging them a lot of times to pray for wisdom for all these situations. And anyway, so I just really love being able to encourage my students as they grow as students, as well as they grow as Latin scholars.
Well, you sound like a teacher when you say that. I suppose, as opposed to an instructor. I mean, being an instructor is great, but there's just something about being a teacher that is more fully fledged, and I think that's what you're talking about. You're talking about care and mentorship.
Yes.
I love it.
Well, thank you. Yeah, that's one of the things that I really noticed and admired most about my favorite teachers, especially my father, was the way they interacted with their students. How you honor that they're people, they're made in the image of God, and you just love being able to be with them for whatever time you have and whatever way you have, whether it's just Latin or if you get the opportunity to meet face to face someday. Um,
Yeah.
fun little trivia fact. Speaking of meeting people face to face someday, my husband actually was in a Latin class with me when we were in high school, and we weren't interested in each other till college, but that's really fun that we met online, kind of through online
Mm-hmm.
high school classes for homeschoolers, and now here we are. We're both online teachers, and um,
Yeah.
that's really fun.
So,
And I have lots of friends that I've had for the last 20 years that we would meet up a lot throughout high school, and we've been friends for a long time.
and all through online education. Yeah, that
Yes.
actually was. So I taught 3 sections of Spanish in a recent spring term that we had as a benefit for homeschoolers because of all the COVID stuff, and I was amazed to see, because most of my experiences in the corporate world, and adults who are very motivated to learn the language, but it's all business, and then to, have these kids, being kids, and some were excellent students, some were not so excellent, but the parents and the kids both gave a lot of feedback about the interactivity and the community and the being able even just to talk to each other in class.
Yes.
And I was surprised by something that apparently you already are quite intimately familiar with, just how much the online learning community, like in the moment, is a real thing. You actually can have community and interaction and enrichment that way.
Yes. Yeah. Yep. It's been a
So,
real blessing.
we are
did
going
not
to be
mean it that way.
advertising
I was
your
afraid
class
it would
as
sound.
too late. Yeah, so meet your spouse in National Latin Exam preparation. Well, Scott says great selling
I should have left that part out.
Probably, but now we're going to clip it and put it on your teacher profile.
No, yeah.
Scott says great selling point, and I don't think he's talking about the marriage possibilities. Oh, he is, man. Okay, yeah, I guess
we
that's
were
the
not
only
interested
thing
in each
people are
other
going to
then,
remember.
but we liked each other as friends.
Wow. Okay, well, I think that's a good note to sign off on. We gave everyone all this gold about Latin and Latin education, but all the audience is going to remember is the matchmaking aspects of Latin education.
Yes.
I really appreciate you being here, and
thank you so much, Joffrey.
Yeah, absolutely. So long, everybody, and I'll look forward to the next live with our next teacher. Thanks again, Emily.
Thank you.
Oh, and do stay on the line, actually. I always forget to say that at the beginning. Stay on the line. We can chat afterwards. Okay, now it's bye for real.